Rembrandt.
Well, Father?
Adrian, here's your brother. He's come home.
Evening, Adrian.
It's a long time since you've been here.
Well, Adrian, I had so much work to do. I have new portraits, commissions.
That's good. The mill's flourishing, too. We're kept busy from morn till night.
I'm glad to hear that, Father.
You're just in time for supper.
You shall read the lesson tonight, son. There.
I considered the days of old, the ancient times. Will the Lord cast off forever? Will he be favorable no more? Hath his mercy clean gone forever? Doth his promise fail forevermore? Hath God forgotten to be gracious? Hath he in anger shut up his tender mercies? And I said, this is my infirmity. But I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the works of the Lord. Surely I will remember thy wonders of old. The waters saw thee, O God, the waters saw thee. They were afraid. The depths also were troubled. The clouds poured out water, the skies sent out a sound. Thine arrows also went abroad. The voice of thy thunder was in heaven, the lightnings lightened the earth, and the earth trembled and shook. But I will meditate also of all thy works, and talk of thy doings. Thy way, O God, is in the sanctuary.
Oh, good morning, everyone. I'm joined this morning by Everett Fox, Alan M. Glick Professor of Judaic and Biblical Studies at Clark University, and translator in 1995, I believe, the 5 Books of Moses. And then more recently, the publication of the early prophets. I believe you did the Samuel translations also in the 90s, and then translations of Joshua.
Kind of a warm-up.
Joshua, Judges, and Kings are newer, and we're going to be talking this morning about translating Bible and about Hebrew and his unique approach to both. So good morning, Professor Fox.
Good morning.
And if you could, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background with Biblical Hebrew. Is it something you grew up with or came to later, and your background in the language?
Well, biblical Hebrew itself, I really didn't encounter as a language and in detail until college. I went to Brandeis, in Massachusetts, and they had a very strong department in Judaica, and especially Bible, people who do text study and grammar and all the nitty-gritty things. And then toward my senior year, I encountered a number, actually, of recordings of various kinds that really got my attention. One of them was done by the late Abba Eban, who was at one point Israel's foreign minister, ambassador to the UN. He was a Cambridge-trained Semitic scholar, and he made a recording for fundraising for the university of from Ecclesiastes and Psalms, which he read with his inimitable English accent, but also in Hebrew in a much more measured way than somebody would do in class, that, and encountering on tape Charles Lawton reading from the Bible in English, a number of there were other recordings in Hebrew and in English, and gradually I I came to feel that the rhythm and the sound were crucial elements. And so then when I encountered the Buber Rosenzweig translation in German, which was in our library at Brandeis, and I was studying with Nachum Glatzer, who was one of their students, and indeed he was the one who in the 1920s would read the text aloud to them and do a lot of research. So all these things came together, and also a musical background that I have, classical music. So this all seemed to somehow fit together. I'm not sure it was conscious, but it was all these influences, and so I became fascinated with, really fell in love with the rhythms of biblical Hebrew. Having said that, we don't know exactly how it was pronounced, but the way that one does it is probably close enough to get a sense of the pulse, I guess I would say, the pulse and the puns and the plays on words, and believe it or not, distinguishing between short and long vowels. I have a son who's a dramaturg, and what he does is he tells actors how to pronounce Shakespeare and what the words mean. And so it's kind of a similar thing. So unless you feel it in your gut, it's a different story. And so my task has been to try and at least reflect that in the English if I can. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it's more difficult. But
a lot of people listening probably recognize the name Martin Buber, but some might not know Franz Rosenzweig. Yeah. So who was Franz Rosenzweig?
Rosenzweig was originally a philosophy student in Germany. He was a brilliant student with a photographic memory who devoured, Western philosophy and history. But at some point he had a kind of religious awakening in his late 20s, and he decided to the horror of his family and friends, to turn down an offer of a full professorship in Germany. This would have been about 1920, and you just didn't do that. That was the pinnacle of society, to be a professor in Berlin. But he turned that down. He instead turned to translating texts and adult education, I guess you could call it. And he's a very difficult philosopher to read.
I was in a seminar and I tried to read A Star of Redemption.
Oh yeah.
I'm sure there's something there, but I could not find it.
No, it's you sort of have to be into Hegel and all those other things. If you were a German student in 1913, you might have a shot at it. but for American trained folks, it's very, very difficult stuff. But he had a real sense of language and an unusual philosophy of translation, where he tried to mold the translation to echo the original, not so much to make you think it was written in German or English, but to really try and go back to kind of primeval sounds. It's kind of a romantic idea. But he in the early 20s contracted ALS, and so died young, although he survived for 7 or 8 years with the aid of some kind of mechanical typewriter equipment, even though he was basically completely paralyzed. So it's a remarkable story. Anyway, he and Buber saw eye to eye on many things, not everything. And so they collaborated on this project. And then Buber continued after Rosenzweig died in 1929.
And Rosenzweig had an idea that I've seen you cite in your writing, the hieros gamos, the divine marriage. Wait, could you talk a little bit about that?
The divine marriage, the melding of language and thought and religiosity. I don't pretend to be a Rosenzweig philosophy expert.
Sure.
So what I would say is that what I do really comes closer to what the performing musician does than it does to a music critic or a musicologist, who analyzes everything intellectually. I mean, I do some of that too, but for me, it's the actual performance. It's the actual, recitation. It's dealing with the words. So I take from Buber and Rosenzweig some of the ideas of the spokenness of the text, but it's really, in a sense, a more practical matter for me than a theoretical one. I don't start with some grand theory. I start with the text. Let's play this piece of music and experience what that's like. And so, of course, you have to have ideas about what it is and how to play it, but and there were things that they could do in German that you just can't do in English. In German, you can make compound words. You can join 2 or 3 words together and create this idea. You try to do that in English, and it comes across as really silly. It doesn't work. They also mined the German language for old words that had dropped out of the language, trying to reflect old Hebrew words. And I didn't do that in English either. I just felt that was going too far. So I tried to adopt it.
In the translator prefaces to your books, and in the second one, you talked about changes in your approach between your first attempts and then the more recent ones. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what your initial approach and vision was, and then how it's changed over the years.
Yeah, I mean, I think originally I started out really wanting to reflect what they had done in German. That is to say, to try and preserve something that had either been lost or, the Holocaust and the war really, made, destroyed the Jewish population in Germany. And so it wasn't clear, who the audience would be, although it has some currency in Germany still, especially in Protestant circles. So part of what I wanted to do was to, in a sense, memorialize this great work. But as time went on, I backed away from that, I guess, and I became more independent. There's also the fact that biblical scholarship has changed a lot in the ensuing decades, and so I felt I had to reflect that as well. So if there was now a scholarly consensus that a word means something else, I really felt I should take that into account. And there's also the issue of trying to be more understandable. Buber and Rosenzweig did something very radical. And since there was no commentary on the same page of the text, they wrote essays, but there was no actual commentary. You had to kind of either have some experience of the Hebrew, or you had to figure out what they were doing. And that wasn't always possible. So over time, I tried to be a little bit clearer in English, at least when the Hebrew was clearer, and not be so out there. And that has continued. Not in the sense of trying to dumb it down or get rid of all the problems, but to have more of a flow when that's called for. So that really has changed over time. I mean, there's still a certain amount of shock value, which I think is important. I really, with the German translation, I really had the experience that sometimes we have going to a Shakespeare performance or a symphony concert where you really think you know the play or the piece, and you sit in your seat comfortably, and all of a sudden this thing comes at you, like, who is this actor or who's this conductor? And wow, I never heard that before. So that was my experience, and I tried to, in a sense, convey some of that. So I don't mind if there are occasional bumps or strange things, because if it makes people stop and think, then I've done my job.
I think one of the things I love about your translation is that it breaks out of kind of stranglehold of the King James Bible. Almost every translation in English is effectively a revision of the King James, and we're very lucky in the English language to have the King James. If we're going to be shackled to something, it's not.
Sure.
It's an amazing literary achievement. But I think it makes familiar what shouldn't be familiar. The King James, along you bring up Shakespeare. I think you can have never read Hamlet before, and when you read it, it all sounds familiar because so much of the language, so many of the phrases are just part of English that it's as if every English speaker has read Hamlet, whether or not he's read Hamlet. And I think there's something the same of the King James. And then when you start looking at the biblical Hebrew, you're entering it's not familiar at all. It's very foreign, mysterious.
No, not really.
And
it
so I love
created it's its own thing, and very often it reflects what's in the Hebrew, but very often it doesn't. It's again, is there any such thing as Hamlet in the abstract sense? And the answer is, of course, no. It really depends on the performance. It depends on how much you cut. It depends on whether you've got Olivier or a high school kid. I mean, it's So the King James, of course, is tremendously influential. But the example I always think of it's kind of funny is that Moses, when he has to flee Egypt and he begins a new life as a shepherd, he gets married, he has a couple of kids, and he names one of his kids Gershom, and the King James says, because I have been a stranger in a strange land. Well, I hear that quoted all the time. It's the title of a famous science fiction novel. I mean, you can just go up and down. But the fact is, the Hebrew uses two words. So, I mean, you can translate it as, I've been a stranger in a foreign land. That would be okay. But a stranger in a strange land sounds so good. But it's just wrong. So, what can you do about that? On the other hand, they had a great ear in many cases. William Tyndale, who's really the first great English Bible translator, some decades before, lost his life in the cause. And the famous passage where Elijah encounters God at Mount Sinai, Tyndale has, after the earthquake and the fire and so on, God appears to Elijah in a small, still voice. Sounds pretty good. King James Committee obviously said it's close, but it's not exact. And so what you read today still is a still, small voice. They just flipped it, and it works much better. So it's the ear of the hearer, and they knew what they were doing.
So you retain in your translation the Hebrew names. We've become so used to the Latinate names. It's interesting that it's all from the Latin and not even the Greek.
Sometimes there's some Greek, but yeah, you're right. It's these very old translated names.
Or even the Greek names of the books. Exodus in Hebrew is Shemot, names. I think it changes how we read it to think of it as Shemot. So I don't know how to ask this as a question, but I'm curious. Names are so important in the biblical text, the changing of names, the meaning of names, and it's hard because the wordplay, like Chava. How do you convey the wordplay there in English? It's very difficult.
So what I did was to put a slash next to the Hebrew and then sort of a translation. And so that way it's in the text. It's not something in a footnote, which you may or may not look at. But you're right. The names are incredibly important. They love to play on them. And to leave that out is really to miss a major piece of what they're trying to do. In the same way, we have examples in English. Dickens does it all the time with amusing names. Pilgrim's Progress, has special names. If you got rid of, for instance, in Dickens, if you got rid of Uriah Heep, you would be losing an awful lot. So you have to pay attention to that. And my solution, following Buber and Rosenzweig, who did it with a comma, is to have the meaning next to the name. But it is hard to get used to these Hebrew-sounding names. People have had the same problem with the Iliad, where some modern translations have done Achilleus, but nobody wants to do that. They all want to do Achilles because that's what we hear.
I've only ever found one translation of the name that works perfectly, which is in the Septuagint. It calls her Zoe, which is a play on Zoon, and so it's its own. It mimics the wordplay exactly, but in Greek. So you lose the lovely name Chava. I really wish that Eve. I mean, Eve is a fine name too, I guess, but it would be wonderful if the old names, the Hebrew names, were in wider circulation, I think. And
it's hard. I eventually in the second book put a glossary in the back with sort of who these people are in one sentence, but also the pronunciation, because there are a lot of names there. But that's part of this project, is to draw people back toward the text and make them confront some of those things. So it requires some work, just like if you go to a concert or you go to the museum and see a painting, you can just encounter these things on a primeval emotional level, or you can do a little digging and learn a couple of things, and then all of a sudden things jump out of the canvas or out of the orchestra that you didn't see before. And that of course is the wonderful experience of learning, and that's what the arts do for us.
Is there a particular passage you've translated that you were really pleased with? A problem that was just a thorny problem that you stumbled across a solution to?
Well, I mean, there are things that are untranslatable, and there are things that if you work really hard, you can get somewhere. I recently was working on Isaiah, which is a whole other set of difficulties. And there's a passage there, I think it's in chapter 10, or I have to check the reference again. But it's a famous passage which is often translated as something like, it's like you go from trouble to an obstacle to a pit. You get into trouble, then you fall, you trip over an obstacle, and then you get out of that and you fall into a pit. It's like from the frying pan into the fire. But the Hebrew is very striking. It's pachad v'fachat v'fach. Well, how do you reflect that in English? You go to the thesaurus and you start looking for alliteration. I couldn't figure out a way to do it, and almost nobody else could. And then I realized I would have to fudge it a little bit. And what I finally did was panic and pitfall and pit. Now, it should have been, according to the exact meaning, panic and pit and pitfall. You fall into the pit, you climb out, and you encounter a pitfall. But rhythmically, it doesn't work as well as panic and pitfall and pit. So then in the next line, I had to go back to the original order. It's a little jarring, but I can't give up that wonderful rhythm. And Isaiah is full of that stuff. I mean, that was one of his main characteristics, that these incredible plays on language meant to really engage his audience. So that's one kind of thing. One of the things that I enjoy doing, and I think works reasonably well, is the end of the creation story. It's actually the beginning of chapter 2 of Genesis, but as you know, the chapter numbers are not original. They seem to have been invented by somebody that I like to call Steve. Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, one of the signers of the Magna Carta. So we owe a lot of our chapter numbers to him, and he did a pretty reasonable job, except in this case, of course.
It's the most curious thing, the separation between 1 and 2.
Yeah, well,
I would love his notes about why he or whoever did it made that choice.
Yeah. I mean, everybody again has their reading. It's like different recordings of a piano piece. Everybody will phrase it differently. Anyway, the chapter 2 begins with a poem, which is really the ending of the creation story. It's a kind of summing up, and biblical Hebrew likes to do this very often at the end of a large section of a book or the end of a chapter. They will put in a shorter or a longer poem. It's like a flourish, and that's what they've done here. Well, this is almost always printed in paragraph form. And it's 3 verses, so then it's broken up that way as well. But if you listen to it, it has a different rhythm. I'll just give you an example of this. Thus were finished the heavens and the earth with all of their array. God had finished on the 7th day his work that he had made, and then he ceased on the 7th day from all his work that he had made. God gave the 7th day his blessing, and he hallowed it, for on it he ceased from all his work that by creating God had made. Now, you could do some of these phrases a little bit differently, but my intention was to try and reflect the very clear poetic thrust of that. And as I say, it's like ending with a flourish. At least the first creation story is over, and things looking pretty good at that moment, and it's all very balanced and rhythmic, which is, by the way, the characteristic of that whole creation chapter. God saw that it was good. It was so. God said. So we're used to this idea of order and balance, and what better way to complete it than with an orderly, balanced poem with certain repeating words and phrases and rhythms. So that's the kind of thing that I like to concentrate on. It's of course not the only thing that's important, but to me it's kind of a prerequisite to getting into the text. That's where I start, and then ideas and feelings and other things, of course. But it's that's the baseline for me. And so if that's not there, then my attention wanders, and and I'm not a happy camper. Like you want to leap up from your seat and say, no, it doesn't sound like that, or you don't read the line that way. It's not what Hamlet is saying.
How do you choose? You use line breaks, which I like a lot, and I do the same thing, even more intensely than you do. But how do you choose where to break the line?
Well, that's always difficult. Buber had his own way of doing that. I sometimes follow that. Very often I will follow some of the Hebrew markings in the text that the Masoretes, the later traditional scribes, did, that are still in use today. So that can be very useful. And some of it is, somewhat intuitive, and you see what works for you. But it's certainly malleable. One could change one's mind, once again, as musicians do. I've studied a lot. I don't know if this name will mean much to folks out there, but the conductor Arturo Toscanini, great conductor, first half of the 20th century, And I came across something he's supposed to have said in old age. He said, I've been conducting the Brahms Second Symphony for 50 years, and for 50 years I was blind and idiot. There's one little thing that I missed. Well, it turns out to be the tiniest marking in one measure in one instrument. I mean, pretty insignificant. But yeah, that's this constant search to reflect the original, and in his case, to try and do it perfectly, which is, of course, impossible. So there's always things that pop up again. And that's happened to be a lot. How come I didn't see that before, or I didn't hear that before?
Rosenzweig says in translation, there's not good and better. There's only like bad and very bad. I don't know.
Yeah, that reminds me of another thing that Toscanini said before a performance. He said to a great cellist, we're no good. I'm no good, and you're no good. And the guy was aghast. And then a couple of minutes silence went by. And then as they were about to go out, Toscanini said, but the others are worse, so let's go do it. Yeah, it's you have to be willing to concede defeat, and that's tough. So you have to be emotionally ready to do that. But it's still important to do, especially when there's stuff out there that doesn't really measure up, or that doesn't reflect, the greatness of this text. I mean, in addition to the foundational religious text, it's also art. So they go hand in hand. You can't really separate them out.
So some translators, like I've been reading the new essay collection by Lydia Davis, who's translating Proust, translator of Proust, and others. Most translators are working with texts where, what are the stakes in translating Proust? I suppose if for a true devotee of literature, the stakes can be quite high, but it seemed something else altogether to translate Bible.
Yeah.
Which is, for Jews and Christians, obviously central text. And so I'm curious for you, how you approach that responsibility.
Well, when I started this, I was basically 21, in one form or another. And that means I was young and naive. So that helped a lot. But it's the experience of tying yourself to something so overwhelming is both overwhelming but also exhilarating. You can play little piano exercises, that's good for your fingers, but to be able to play, one of the works of the masters, even badly, is pretty exciting, and is you become part of a larger process. So I think for me it had a lot to do with trying to make a contribution and trying to link up with a centuries long process. And of course, I hope that underneath it all, that nobody will use my text for some terrible purpose. I suppose it's always possible. But it came from the desire to give something back to this German work, but also ultimately to contribute something to the Jewish world, the Christian world. And, if it had floundered completely, then that's that. But to the extent that it has garnered a bit of an audience and people find it useful and it keeps them off the street, so to speak, right? And doing something peaceful and thoughtful and wrestling with questions in their own lives that are ancient questions. That's satisfying. But I try not to think too much about. This is not. I mean, Martin Luther did the whole Bible and changed the German language. Really founded the modern German language. I don't have pretensions quite like that. And Buber and Rosenzweig hoped that their translation would lead to some kind of transformation in society. I don't have any illusions about that, especially not this year, when everything's so difficult. But to the extent that it can shine some light on these great symbols and characters and moments and religious moments, the call, when somebody is called upon unexpectedly. Man is a shepherd in the desert minding his own business. Well, that's pretty dramatic. How is that reflected in the text? So I do have a certain faith that the text has its own power. It's not for me to say, where that goes. So I'm trying to provide some of the raw materials, I guess you could say.
I was talking with a friend yesterday who he and his family are reading through Genesis right now.
Mhm.
And something we talked about is how we all know the stories. And then when you actually read them, it's shocking how short they are. That the story of Babel or any of these stories,
it's a couple of lines.
They're huge in your mind, and yet they're just a few lines. And it's remarkable that in almost any translation that power comes through. That the original text is somehow overpowers even kind of middling translations somehow, and its brevity is the thing that I am always just shocked by, how biblical Hebrew as a language is able to do so much in so few words, and then how the author of Genesis is able to do so much and with so little.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I'm curious what your favorite. So you've done the books of Moses and now the early prophets. I'm curious of these, what your favorite section or story has been as a reader and as a translator. And I'm curious if it's different.
There's a few of them. I would say the same thing with music. What's your favorite piece of music? I wouldn't.
Yeah, sure.
I'll give you a list. I can make it a fairly short list, but it's a list. So in this case, there are several. The Jacob material, especially the wrestling scene and everything around that, is one great favorite because of what happens, which is so mysterious, but also the language, the use of certain repeating words, a motif of the face. The man who's left alone in a wild gorge at night and wrestles a stranger. I mean, you can do so much with that on many levels. Religious, secular, psychological. You can go and. So that's one favorite.
Do you feel you understand that scene more now than you did, or does it get more mysterious every time you look at it?
Well, it's both. It's both the familiar and mysterious, and more profound. But it also depends on where you are in your life. So, and the wrestling that you're doing. I always tell students, when you read the story in Genesis 22 of Abraham almost sacrificing his son, if you read that when you're 10 or 15 years old, you will, of course, identify with the kid. If you read it when you're 40 and a parent, you have a different perspective. And, not a word has changed in the text, but you have. So that's very often what happens. Another favorite is the Bilam story, Balaam, the pagan prophet, and his donkey. Great story, and also great poetry, where at some point when he stops doing his hocus pocus and gets a real vision from God, not only does his perception change, but the language changes. It's like he goes into a higher gear of poetry. So that's very exciting. Another one, the Samson cycle, great favorite of mine, partly because of the language and partly, of course, because of the action and this very bizarre character, this anti-hero, does everything wrong, but still, manages to accomplish something. And then finally, the David and Bathsheba story, which is a masterpiece of language and whose reverberation stretches from just David King stories to David stories to kingship stories to Israel's, it's like concentric circles. So all of those have a lot of resonance, but what they have in common, of course, is how they use sound and language to convey things that adjectives and adverbs don't. Biblical Hebrew has very few adjectives, for instance. If you read the Iliad, Homer's always describing everything from Achilles' shield to how heroes die in battle. The spear goes in one part of their neck and comes out their arm, But in biblical Hebrew, things are either, large, small, and 4 or 5 other words. So as you say, the language is incredibly compact. And that gives you, as a reader and a hearer, a lot of space between the lines to flesh it out, to insert yourself. It's a little bit, tiny bit like radio used to be back in the 30s and 40s, where, aside from, sound effects with horses' hooves and creaking doors, the rest of it is all in your head. It's a stormy night outside, so you hear it, but you have to conjure up the picture. And so the Bible, for whatever reason, leaves out so much, and so it begs the reader to fill in. And as you know, that's been filled in all kinds of fruitful and unfruitful ways over the centuries. Somebody in the Middle Ages decided that Eve gives Adam an apple. And one of the reasons for that is that the Latin word for apple and the Latin word for evil are homonyms. They sound the same. But they don't. I don't think they had Macintosh apples in ancient Israel. I could be wrong, but that has stuck in our minds. So no relationship to the text. It's, after all, the fruit of the tree of knowledge. So there are all kinds of things like that which we have overlaid on the text. Buber and Rosenzweig had this idea that we want to go back to the bare original text. Well, not sure that scholars agree that there is such a thing. These things tend to be cumulative. They develop over time. We don't know the exact process by which they came together. But what we have, the finished product, has all these wonderful voices and feelings. And the Bible's an anthology. It's not a book in the totally consistent sense. So you can have in Deuteronomy, the reason that your kingdom was destroyed or will be destroyed is you've broken the covenant, you've broken the treaty with God. Very clear. And along comes Job and says, "It doesn't work. I did everything right, and look at my life; it's a mess." So how can both of those exist in the same collection? The answer is they do. So that tells you something about the ancient mindset, that they were interested in multiple voices and not just one party line, but the richness and the enigmas of human experience.
If Buber and Rosenzweig were sitting in your office, what would you like to ask them?
What would I like to ask them? I mean, over time, even in the early years, their translation changed. So I wouldn't have to ask them about that because they already, did things differently as they aged and as the work aged. I might ask them how they saw some of the conclusions of contemporary biblical scholarship. When I started this work pretty much in the 70s, it was not at all part of mainstream biblical studies. My first university job, I did not get tenure. By the time the 90s rolled around, there were a lot of people doing reading the Bible using the tools of literature and paying more attention to these things. So that worked out okay. So I'd be curious how they would see developments since the 1920s and 30s. I mean, Buber finished it in 62 or 61, but that's 60 years ago. And a lot has been discovered. We know much more of languages, ancient languages of the area. There are archaeological discoveries, but there's also different techniques for reading a text. So I'd be curious how they would look at that.
How do you recommend someone set about learning biblical Hebrew now? What do you? I don't know if you teach the language.
I've done it a little bit. I haven't had a lot of students ask me about it. I had one student some years ago who was very enthusiastic. He was pretty good at languages and he started getting into it. And I said to him, look, at this point, what you really need to do is you need to photocopy pages from this book, which is verb tables. It's like the most rote, boring thing you can imagine. The list, as you would in almost any language. I go, you go, he goes, she goes, right? And I want you to, Xerox these 10 pages and stick them up on your dorm wall. And every night before you go to bed or every morning for 10 minutes, I want you to, recite it. He didn't do it. That was not, he was not going in that direction. But there is a certain amount of paradigm learning. There are a number of pretty good textbooks.
I used Xiao when I learned.
Which one is that? Oh, yeah,
Xiao, which I liked a lot, but it's quite dry.
Yeah, so I mean, it depends on who you are, and there was a small book. I don't think it's in print anymore. Written many years ago by Moshe Greenberg, who was a great scholar, and he very quickly in that book started using little pieces from the Joseph story as sentences and paragraphs to work on. It worked very well. So but there are enough of these books around that one could probably find a compatible one. And there's, I imagine, stuff online as well. You have to be committed to do it. It's not impossible. The vocabulary is not huge. It's really just a couple of thousand words in the Hebrew Bible. And the grammar and the structure, once you get used to it, it's its own thing. You get to start to feel the rules. I mean, the really striking one, which would be a little intimidating for beginners. It's Introduction to Biblical Hebrew Syntax, which is
Walke and O'Connor.
Walke O'Connor, yeah. I mean, this is like the Bible. It really lays everything out with a lot of examples. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure you could just sit down and read it. I mean, you could do it with a teacher. It probably makes sense to have a living person in there, that can guide you and correct you. But it is doable. It's not, it's not an impossible language.
So besides Rosenzweig and Buber, have you found any writing about translation to be helpful or interesting to you?
I have a little section of my library. There are a number of conferences and collected, essays and stuff like that. I look at them for interest, but I don't. Again, I haven't really looked for a philosophy so much, that's
Sure.
all that's spelled out. So maybe I should do more of that. But I have.
It always strikes me that there's a whole world of translation theory. And
Yes.
it always strikes me as funny how little it has to do with anyone who actually translates.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, would I apply the same criteria to translating Proust or Tolstoy or Kafka? The answer might well be no. I mean, there's something very particular to dealing with the Bible. People are going to read Kafka, but most of them are not going to take a line out of one of his stories and make it a centerpiece of their life, hopefully, and it won't affect religious communities to the extent that somebody's going to go to war over how you translate Kafka, the way we have brilliantly done for centuries over the way we translate the Bible. I'm always reminded of these striking scenes from the early 1950s when the Revised Standard Version came out, and there were book burnings in the South because the translators had taken a very important verse and done it differently, and it really upset people. So it is tricky. I mean, the good news is there's a lot of stuff out there, but people have strong feelings, as probably know. There's this unofficial movement called the King James Only movement, and the old joke is, if it was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. Or you could switch it to, if it's good enough for St. Paul, it's good enough for me. You can insert whatever name you want. So, behind that is a strong and sincere desire to know, well, what is the Word of God? How do you find that? And is there a translation that is, direct line? So depending on your philosophy and belief system, you might go in that direction. So it's tricky. But I don't spend a lot of time with translation theory, I have to say.
I think that's a sign that you're a translator.
I guess.
You spend your time with Hebrew.
Yeah, I mean, there are performers also who are, again, actors and musicians, some of whom are more intellectually based than others, and others who, use the method or some other, approach to acting or performing music. But I mean, obviously, the further you get into the work, the more you learn. But everybody has a teacher they swear by. Oh, you have to do it this way. This is what I was taught. So there's a lot of room. It's a big tent, I think.
So one last question about your translation is, I'm curious how you settled the problem of translating the Tetragrammaton, the name of God. It's a difficult problem. I know Buber and Rosenzweig wrote about their approach, and you took a different.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, some of that is a practical thing, and some of it has changed because language and perception has changed. So whereas years ago you could just use the Lord and nobody raised a peep about that, but thanks to the women's movement and various other things, there are lots of folks out there who find that difficult to deal with. I mean, first of all, we don't have kings and lords anymore. We just have oligarchs and corporations. which is the same thing. But so that became a little bit problematic. Buber and Rosenzweig, as you saw, did this very striking thing where they did personal pronouns in uppercase letters. So instead of saying, the Lord said to Moses, and I've heard there's a record where Buber reads and you can hear him. I don't think it's online, but I could be wrong. So Buber would say, he said to Moses. Well, it's very dramatic, very striking, and almost definitely wrong. So I really felt I couldn't go with that. Now, in Jewish tradition, when you come to that name, you don't read it straight. You don't read it to sound something like Jehovah. Some scholars do Yahweh. In Jewish tradition, it's Adonai, which literally means my Lord. So some people do it that way. Adonai said to Moses, and others do the Eternal said. So there are a lot of possibilities. I chose to do it in uppercase YHWH with the note, and there's a whole page at the beginning of the book. I don't know if anybody reads it, of course, to say you should read it as is comfortable for you. And so students and others will, when I teach it, will read it how they want to do that. So some people will say Adonai, some people will say the Lord. Some people will just say God. And this has appeared with Bible, it's appeared with Jewish and Christian liturgy. How do we address God in prayer? And everybody's still struggling with this. Is God a he? In the Hebrew Bible, he doesn't really seem to be. On the other hand, you have masculine and feminine verbs, so sort of comes out as a he, and sometimes he's a warrior. So, we go back and forth about all this stuff. I wanted to reflect some of the original in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The name of God is written in the older script, as if I would do that with Gothic on every time his name appeared. So I wanted to give people some options, but in the end, it's not easy to solve. But I definitely did not go the Buber Rosenzweig route, except at the very beginning when I started publishing. But these are ongoing questions. It's process as much as definitive decisions.
Well, thank you so much for answering all these questions and spending time this morning. And to anyone out there listening, make sure you go and get Everett Fox's translation of the early prophets. And if you somehow don't have the books of Moses, get that too. And I think it's wonderful that it's published by Schocken, which is such a lovely continuity with the German Jewish tradition. And
yeah.
So it's it couldn't have had a better publisher, I think.
Well, it's even more than that. In Rosenzweig's letters, he says, sometimes I worry that Germans won't be able to stomach this very un-German translation, but maybe after 70 years, like Jeremiah's prophecy, maybe it will take. Well, my English was published exactly 70 years later, so don't know how mystical one wants to get about that, but it was very meaningful to me that it happened that way.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
A pleasure.